So when somebody says, well, I have to ask the question, did Jesus live? Well, I'm trying to paint the picture that if you look, there are too many places in here, and I haven't even touched the prophecies that were spoken and uttered hundreds of years before he came in the flesh. Well, I could talk about, there's so many different places to look at. It's almost like, where do I go first? So some of you get on my social media feed, and it starts off innocent, but some of you go and you might look or see. So I want to just give you an idea about this. So between several people, there was a conversation about purgatory. Of all things to discuss on a Protestant site. Okay, so one person says, that's not what purgatory is. What exactly is purgatory in your opinion? And the other person answers and says, I'm no theologian. I depend on a wealth of knowledge contained within, and blah, 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 blah. Here's the thing. You have a right to your opinion. This is not a cult. You can think whatever you want. But when I give instruction, you should at least pay attention to the fact that I have at least taken the time to research. And this is a topic that is sorely abused, right? All you've got to do is look at the English word purgatory. I touched on this, I think, a week or two ago. It is from a word, we use the same word in concept from the Greek to purge. That Greek word catharize. It is to remove impurities. Now, hear me out. You have a lifetime on earth to get yourself covered in stuff. It's the blood of Christ that washes, cleanses, and makes you whole. That happens in your lifetime while you are alive, not while you're in the grave. So you got to think, and this is why I've been saying, you got to think about what you do here. Because the Bible makes it very clear, when people cross over, there is no getting back to another side. Wherever you end up, read the Bible, it becomes abundantly clear. If you think there's a holding place where your fate can be decided, you actually decided your fate on earth while you were here by what you decided to trust in or not. That's what it boils down to. So this whole idea of you can live your life however you want, get to the end, die, and be in some pseudo soup state where your fate is decided of where you're going to end up, that is not in the Bible, okay? You spend your lifetime here on earth. I've said this before, boot camp, training for eternity. You learn the lessons now. That is why he says, enter in, well done, good and faithful servant. He doesn't, well, let me think about that for a minute. It's either yes or no. This is why we read a lot about the entrance is narrow, the way is narrow. Well, if everybody could find it and everybody could get in, everybody would be in. So make no mistake about this. I know a lot of folks, you like to talk and discuss, and that's good. But at some point, doctrinally, you need to know why you don't believe or do believe doctrines that are widely propagated, and that's kind of been a little bit of my mission, to mine out where these originated from and debunk them if there is that need to do that, okay? Okay, you have to kind of follow me a little bit this morning, because what I present to you is gonna at first sound a little jumbled and disconnected, and I will not finish the message today. I already know that. Spoiler alert. Okay, so, and this was kind of an interesting topic to get off the ground. See, every year, and I try to maybe twice a year present something regarding the resurrection, at least twice a year. Most, I think, years I've failed, but okay. Without exception, every time I want to present the resurrection, whether it's just a resurrection message, proofs, whatever, the first thing that happens immediately after that is I'll get a floodgate of messages that say, well, but how do you know Jesus lived? And it's like, okay, well, I can't deal with explaining that. That is a message all of its own. And I thought, you know, I'm going to try and go down this pathway without it being connected to the resurrection or the life of Christ in general. So this kind of will be an interesting way to gather information so that you might say, well, what do you say when skeptics ask, or when people who say, well, I just don't believe that? Now, there's enough information if you take the Bible apart and you're digging, there's enough information there. If you want to know about the life of Christ. But what generally happens is people want an answer. And when you start going down this pathway, it becomes a little bit challenging, and I'll tell you why. Okay, you're using the Bible. We must use the Bible first before we go outside the Bible. And I'm going to put a little footnote right here for those who just don't listen properly. Okay, this has happened twice already in my tenure here, in my time here as pastor, where I have made statements, this one probably a couple of months ago, about the date of Christ's birth. And there was an individual who's, thank God, not in this congregation anymore, but there was an individual here who would have preferred to weigh out the date of Christ's birth by strictly looking to the pyramid and the pyramid information. And I'm sorry if you do that, the pyramid may align up perfectly with the Bible, but you're using the Bible first. This is the book that we turn to first. You've got to explore and really strip back everything in this book first before you go looking for second and tertiary pieces to support. Okay, I don't care, you can go secular, but you've got to exhaust this first. And then you can possibly, from exhausting this, go into history and try to start reconstructing certain things, which can be very difficult. This is why sometimes I'll dabble in archaeology, or I will go back to a language. Those are the things that we need when we can't agree necessarily on how to approach a certain passage. So what I want to say here is that part of the problem in doing a message like this, I'm focused on answering the question, did Jesus live? And if so, what are the proofs? How can you shore this up? So I'm going to say a lot of things in here and I will explain their controversies. But this is not a message dating to put a date on the birth of Christ, just to point out that there are several issues around trying to have an accurate date. One of them, of course, which every single person who has been part of this ministry knows. You've got a completely different way of reckoning in the Old Testament, not the same as we move into the New Testament. You're looking at conflation for most people who don't understand between Julian, Gregorian, and Hebrew reckoning, and they just want to homogenize it, or they heard something, but they can't figure out how to actually parse this. So they'll make statements, and I'm not wanting to do that because there's enough, as I said, controversy that makes it difficult enough to begin with. So people will say, well, what about conventional evidence, if we're going for whatever that would mean? Here's the problem. We don't have a birth certificate for the child Jesus Christ. We don't have a death certificate. We may have a tomb or a grave, but unlike modern tombs and modern graves where you've got a tombstone that says so-and-so is buried here, we don't have that. So everything that we have must come from this book to basically, we'll call it reconstruct some concepts to at least start the conversation. As I said, it's very, very difficult to get this topic off the ground because there's just so much that has to be explained. The first place that we might start looking is in what are called the infancy narratives in the New Testament. Now, I want to try and say this in the best way possible. As I said, we are first students of the Bible, so the whole idea must be you're approaching this, whether you approach it as a complete skeptic, I don't believe anything in the book, or whether you're approaching it as, I just started, I'm not quite sure, or whether you're old school and this is all like the back of your hand. There must be this, I'm going to look to try and find as much evidence as possible. So you've got to start there. You can't start with saying, well, there's no evidence, because there are internal evidences. But let me just say this. I'm using the Bible first, but I could make many cases outside of the Bible, going, for example, believe it or not, going to look at other religions. That becomes very interesting. How do you establish a brand new religion in 630 some AD? And to this religion, whether you give it any credence or you discount it, but to this religion, Jesus more than existed. He was a prophet. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a prince. He wasn't Messiah or Savior, but he existed. He is spoken of as a real, living, breathing person. That is out of the Quran. And then you've got the dilemma of, if you're going to go back into the Bible, the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day, you don't hold a trial, a legal trial, for someone that doesn't exist. I don't know about you, maybe, actually, we might do that here in America with our mental illness, but you wouldn't do that. These are respected religious leaders in their community. So holding a trial for someone that doesn't exist makes no sense. They even acknowledged that he did, but they called him a blasphemer. And Josephus, the historian Josephus, mentions Jesus, chronicles him. So you've got Muslims and Jewish writers. They have no problem saying he existed. We're only talking about looking at internal evidences so that when people say, well, this is just all, some great story. Well, it has to be a little bit more than just a great story for all of this to make sense. So we're going to start, as I said, with the infancy narratives. That is where we encounter the Christ child. And there's something in those records that I really want to point out. We read about wise men that sought to find the child. And again, I don't think men who were called wise, and I'm going to explore that in a minute, I don't think they would have pursued. They were looking for signs and omens in the sky. That's what they did. I don't think that they would be very wise if they set out to leave their land to search for this child who is to be born King of the Jews. I don't think they'd be very wise if they were searching after a fable. I don't think they'd be very wise if they were searching to find like the lost city of whatever. But they saw a sign, whatever that was, and we know obviously the star that they followed. But the point is, you've got to kind of peel back all the layers around the infancy narratives to ask yourself the question, if this is just a mere fabrication, there are a lot of things here that a very smart person would not include, including men. And I need to say this now, I've taught on this before, there were not 3 wise men, okay? Let's just put that down. I know many of you have sent me cards with 3 men on the card. And I look at it and I go, did I not teach you anything? I'm just joking. But there had to have been more than 3 men. We get the idea that there were 3 men because there are 3 gifts that were presented to the Christ child. But we know that there would not be just simply 3 men making that harsh trek. Because just think about this. The items they were carrying in their day, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. If you think about what they were carrying, those were very precious, very expensive. So they had to be traveling in a greater caravan than just 3. That's a sidebar we'll come back to. Here's where the problem begins, and let me just kind of talk about this in general. In fact, I printed out from a couple of different sites just to give you an idea that the confusion knows no boundaries. We know that Herod gave the edict to basically kill all children 2 years and under when he had heard the news that there was a child that was to be born, and the nomenclature attached to this child that he would be king of the Jews set Herod off in a rage. So kill all the children 2 and under. Here's the problem we start to see in trying to date things. If you go to certain secular sites, and I know I said we're going to talk about the Bible, but Herod isn't the Bible. We need to find out and ask a question. Most secular sites say that Herod died in 4 BC. Traditional teaching in the church places, there is no zero in time, place the birth of Christ somewhere either 1, 2, 3 BC. Some have placed it on the AD side, which makes no sense, but that's another story. But the one thing, the first place you've got to look is history. So we have this the 4 date of Herod dying. And this becomes a problem because depending on which sources you're going to look to try and put together a timeline, this date is widely held. There are other scholars that put his death at 1 to 2. But here again, there are enough secular records talking about his successors that this, just right at its face value, puts a wrench in things. But let me stop right there. If we're trying to, because there's so many dynamics attached to this, this could get confusing. But let's go back to the thing we're trying to get at. If we're trying to establish that Jesus lived, what would be the point if Jesus didn't live and was not brought into this world with a prophecy, born of a virgin, to become king of the Jews, as it was said? What king in their right mind would issue an edict to kill all children under the age of 2 for just a story that possibly might not have been true, that there will be a child born who will become king of Israel? You'd have to be a little bit insane, if you think about it, to kill male children, wiping out, 2 generations possibly or more? So would you do that on a hunch without proof? Would you do it? It just doesn't make sense. So again, this is not a hard evidence, but it says it would be irrational to issue an edict if this child didn't pose a threat or actually had not come into the world. The difficulty you're going to get in trying to line up the dates here is that if you're using the traditional dating that most people place the birth of Christ at anywhere from 1 to 3 BC, and Herod died in 4, remember, the wise men came and talked to Herod. Herod inquired to want to know if they knew where the Christ child was. They didn't disclose, by the way. But what is interesting is they made this journey. So from whatever land they came from, and let's talk about these wise men for a minute, because this becomes, again, not a hardcore, well, here's a piece of evidence to take, but it becomes just part of painting the picture that if this is all fabricated, it really doesn't make too much sense. So we can trace the history of the Magi, or the wise men, some 6 centuries before Christ was born. That's their lineage. Originally part of a larger tribal group out of the Medes or the Persians. No one can really define this because it's quite ambiguous. But they were a priestly group. They wielded a tremendous amount of influence even over their own king, because their, we'll call it mysticism, their understanding of the stars, they looked to any sign in the sky. And we'll say that modern astronomy, probably even modern astrology, but modern astronomy owes a great debt to the developments of their understanding. And that might seem a little weird. You go back and you start seeing these were very advanced in their understanding of a lot of things that took centuries, maybe more than that, for science to say this is actually right or true. So we have to start with, they made this trek and they had to have some sign. It wasn't like they just woke up one day and said, oh, we're going to follow that sign. They were looking for a sign. They had been looking to the stars, looking to eclipses, looking to everything, whatever the symbol was. And I keep saying that because there had to be more than just the star they followed. But whatever the sign that they followed, they were wise enough to follow the star right to where they could find Christ. Now, I don't know about you, but I want you to kind of try and think the way I'm thinking. There's no GPS. That's like finding a needle in a haystack. If you really think about it, oh, we're going to set out to go find the Christ child. Okay, sounds like a good idea to me, right? Where the hell are you going to look? Just, in our modern age, you can find my phone and you'll go there, ping off of a tower. They didn't have that. So finding Jesus is like finding a needle in the haystack. Couple that with the fact that I don't think, if you go back and you read the narratives, I don't think that Joseph and Mary were trying to be very public about from birth to the time the child is a few years old. I think they're not trying to be very public about this. So add to that, if you were kind of hiding out a little bit and laying low for these men to come the distance they did to find this child, I might say, well, it sounds like a really good story to me. But again, who are these wise men that they would even take interest in pursuing to try and find this child? Now we know, if you go back far enough into history, and the history we've already talked about, when the folks in the southern kingdom were carried away into Babylon, there's very good reason to believe that these Magi were somewhere in the same territory, in that area where they were dropped in, where they were basically camped out for that specific period in their history. So there's good reason to believe and associate those people, as I said, Iran, Iraq, Persia, that whole area. But what is interesting is that somewhere they had read, and whether that was exposure to the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, or whether they had heard the prophecy, but they had been exposed to the knowledge that there would be a child born who would be like no other child. So again, I'm asking you, if this child doesn't exist, they made a trek from here to there for no reason. They couldn't have bestowed the gifts. They didn't come to worship, and that's another anomaly. These men, it doesn't say who they are or what they are in nature, just wise men, Magi, I've said possibly from where they came from, coming to worship the Christ child, not yet even having spoken a doctrine or having presented himself to the world publicly. That's mind-boggling right there. I mean, think about it. Okay, so these are the things when I say we have to keep picking apart, because as you start putting together this picture, it becomes a little bit silly if this is just a mere facade, like a woven fable, to be this intricate and detailed in what we know the Bible tells us. So, what about Herod? It's another sidebar. Ruthless, ruled as a tyrant. He was bloodthirsty. He would kill anyone that got in his way, including his own flesh and blood. And of course, this is the interesting thing. He was an Edomite, an Edomian, a descendant of Esau. So kind of go back even, you could make a lot of cases in here for going back into Genesis and understanding passages that will keep repeating themselves. Esau, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. We have another kind of concept that represents itself in the time of Christ between Herod and the Christ child. Again, spirit and flesh. I could go off on a message there, but I'm trying to stay focused. All right, so Herod, he ingratiates himself to the Jewish population by marrying into the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees, if you remember those folks. So it's kind of interesting that he did whatever it would take to keep his power, make these alliances and associations. So you get a picture of this man, not some out there. He kind of fits the picture of a typical ruler of his day. So I'm going to ask the question again. If you could spend the time, because I just gave you a 30-second thumbnail picture of Herod, but if you could spend the time to understand about his rule and reign, the likelihood of him entertaining somebody's babble about a child to be born, unless it was really a real present threat to him, not plausible. So we come back to this whole killing of children 2 years and under, which did happen. That kind of tells you Herod was very concerned, very worried for this child being born. If it's just a fabrication, why would he care? Who cares? Just a kid, another kid amongst many. All right. Tradition has, I'm going back to the wise men now. Tradition has the wise men on camels, bearing gifts as they approach. But if we are looking to the Bible, we don't have names of these men. Now, the names that we have come out of the 6th century, Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar. I just thought that was really kind of bizarre because imagine somebody came up with names, whether they're real or not, but there's 3 names. Very interesting. So I think those names might be dubious and play into the same mindset that says 3 men only, but that's for you to disseminate, not for me. I'm just putting it out there, right? So many people dismiss the infancy narratives as just mythological and it's just part of this great fabled tapestry that we read about. But here's my problem. Again, the infancy passages are so intricate that once you start digging in those passages, you realize this cannot be. If it is fabricated, it is the greatest con of building an incredible tapestry to come to the point of the Christ child coming into the world. And I'll explain. All you've got to do is look at the information given, which we're going to get into before the end of the message, of John the Baptist, his parents. There's a whole host of information given in detail about Zechariah and Elizabeth, but specifically about Zechariah, instructing us, giving us clarity of his service in the temple. Why go through all of that intricate detail, which I'm going to get into, to reveal to us, if you're willing to look at what's there, giving us the approximate date for the birth of John the Baptist, and we know 6 months later Christ was born. The intricate detail there, why go to that trouble to spin all of that information, because it's quite verbose, if Jesus never was born? Why bother telling us about John the Baptist in the infancy narratives to continue later on that John the Baptist is the forerunner to Christ? There's so many of these pieces that you cannot just ignore. So when somebody says, well, I have to ask the question, did Jesus live? Well, I'm trying to paint the picture that if you look, there are too many places in here, and I haven't even touched the prophecies that were spoken and uttered hundreds of years before he came in the flesh. Well, I could talk about, there's so many different places to look at. It's almost like, where do I go first? And you start really recognizing that, okay, in a fabricated story, you might tell some wild tales and make it very intricate, but it has to continue, that this whole, we'll call it, as I'm using the word tapestry, has to continue to make sense and be fluid into the future. That includes the coming of John the Baptist as a forerunner. That includes the prophecies that were spoken of John the Baptist in the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi. How do you do that? How do you say a prophecy? And people have said, well, you know, Jesus was a fraud. He took all of these statements that could have been directed to him or anyone else and said they were of him. Okay, if you want to make that argument, but then what the heck do you do with John the Baptist, who didn't come for any other reason than to be the forerunner, who is spoken of in the Old Testament as coming before Christ? What do you do with that? So these are all the ways that we start kind of pulling at the fabric to test it. And believe me when I say God's not offended that we do that. Now, I just mentioned prophecy. Something kind of interesting to ask the question of. And a lot of people have kind of chewed on this one. I think it's quite valid. There is a prophecy passage in Numbers, if you're familiar with it, Numbers 24, I think. Let me see. Numbers 24. Yes. So Numbers 24:17, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, destroy the children of Sheth. And Edom shall be a possession. You can read the whole thing, but the idea of this star out of Jacob, I believe that these wise men had access to the first 5 books of the Bible. I believe they saw this prophecy, a star out of Jacob, and associated that immediately with Christ. And there may have been others, but this one seems to be like right there. So it's important, because you might ask, well, where would these people, if they're not looking to the Word, where would they get this information? Well, I think I may have just answered the question. So there's another question that has to be asked. Why is it that only the Magi, the wise men, saw the star in the sky and not Herod? That's a big question. Now, if you're a person you're a skeptic, you don't believe, you'd say, yeah, it's because it's all made up. I'd prefer to say that that star, which actually was an actual star, but also I believe symbolized the presence of the Lord leading these men, I would have to say this is the principle that God has wanted to show us through centuries after centuries, that some people have eyes to see, and he reveals himself to some and not to others. Herod was not an example of the one you'd want to follow. I'm not saying that these wise men were either, but he chose to make it revealed to them. That opens up another conversation. And I can't cover it now because it's pretty intricate, but God willing, we'll cover it next week. We need to talk about that star, because that star is very important. And when people talk about there was a comet, and they say, oh, there was a comet that cleared the sky in 4 BC. And then people start back to these dates. So I want to talk about the star because it becomes important. I do want to touch on some concepts of what's in the sky that these wise men may have actually seen, because in their study of the stars, they could see things that we now are able to understand, but back then would probably not have made much sense. And for that, we'll have to look at a passage out of Revelation. I'm not doing that today, but I do want to talk about this because it's tying all these pieces together, that next time somebody asks you, you have a lot of different angles to go at. And you might say, but you're just talking about the infancy portion. Yeah. And then we have to get into the ministry of Christ. And then there's so many steps to this to cover the whole person's life, that each step of the way, there is internal evidence, and then there is what I've called the secondary and tertiary evidences that I'm wanting to present to you, that when people, either by being skeptics or people who just never studied, don't care, say, well, how do you prove all this? Well, you start in this book. As I've said redundantly, you start in this book. So most commentators will give the understanding of the gifts that these men came bearing, gold associated with the color of eternity. And I think that's proper. But also in this case, I would say, think back to the tabernacle, how the tabernacle, a lot of the furniture, acacia wood, the humanity of Christ, or the humanity, the humanity of Christ, and the gold overlay symbolizing his divine nature. Think of the gold as associating not just eternity, because it is eternal, but think of it also as what it represented in the now, his kingly or priestly or prophetic reign, all of these associated with the color gold. And then, of course, myrrh associated with his sufferings. You've got a lot of concepts that are traditionally, they're okay. There's not going to be an issue if you say the gold symbolizes that. It's not going to be that crucial. What is crucial, though, is to recognize something. Just like the woman who came with the alabaster box, who broke the box on Jesus, and the statement, why this waste? The ointment could have been sold and the money could have been given to the poor. It would have not made sense whether Christ was a baby, which we know he wasn't by the time the wise men came. He had to be a toddler, because the Greek word changes in the New Testament from baby to a little bit older. I'll mention those words in a minute. But here's the thing. Even a 2, a 3, a 4, 5-year-old, can you imagine bringing and laying at the foot of 5-year-old gold, precious gold, myrrh, frankincense, that these would have represented in today's concept riches untold? Can you imagine placing that at the feet of a child? So either these guys are messed up in the head, or they really did come to worship. And by the way, their worship wasn't just lip service. They came and offered an offering. Just all of these things make you kind of have to stop and say, well, who would do that? Now, I brought you to Micah for a second. In Micah, there's a statement. And this is what's so interesting. Micah 5:2 says, whose origins are from old, from ancient times, days of eternity. Why does that passage matter? It's in the Old Testament. Why does it matter? Because it is revealing Messiah as pre-existent. They're not saying the child just came and there he was. This information out of Micah 5:2 says he was pre-existent. We know that in the beginning, when it says, in the beginning, God created, Bereshit bara Elohim, majestic plural, not used of one, but it is referencing the triune God. We have the Spirit, we've got the Father and the Son there at creation. This is why Jesus could say, before Abraham was, I am. He is pre-existent. Now this becomes a little bit more difficult, because you might say, well, how do you prove that? Well, it kind of makes it a little bit easier to say Jesus lived and was a child in a manger or grew up and whatnot than it is to try and wrap your mind around him being pre-existing, right? You got to start somewhere, okay? If this is hard for you, you got to start by climbing the ladder of understanding. So you start first with, okay, I can wrap my mind around a child was born and prophecies were foretold. The book of Isaiah says that a virgin, and of course, a virgin will give birth to a child. This whole argument that this couldn't possibly happen, the folks that parse that passage say, well, it doesn't really mean that. Well, what does it mean? Well, if it doesn't mean that one who never had sexual relations is going to have a child, I don't know what that means. We'll leave that one alone. Okay, because I'm not going to explain that today. If I have to do that, we have some serious problems. So, according to Matthew 2:11, let's take a look at what Matthew 2:11 says. Matthew 2:11. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother. So, keep reading. And fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh. Now, here's what's interesting. Every picture that we see at Christmas time They're in a manger. You got the baby that's all wrapped up like a loaf of bread. I don't know where that came from. And you got the 3 wise men with their camels bearing gifts. But it didn't happen like that. See, these are the things, if you're reading it, if you're really reading it and you're not doing the cartoon comic book version, it says they were come into the house. They were in a house already. So we also know that Jesus was not, he's referred to as Paidon or Paidion, our version of toddler. Luke gives more chronological information regarding the birth of Christ because of the information given regarding John the Baptist that comes before it. And you know that Luke set out to put all things in order, right? So in Luke 1:5, let's take a look at that. Luke 1:5. I know it's difficult to turn those pages. Can I just tell you how much I appreciate you? I mean, really, you put up with a lot because I can dump a lot of stuff on you and you come back for more. That's how much I appreciate you. Okay, Luke 1:5. There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah or Abijah, and his wife was the daughter of the daughters of Aaron. Her name was Elizabeth. And this passage starts giving us the lineup, if you will, of all the information. And the key thing, again, we're trying to ask the question, how can we know? If somebody, a disbeliever, a skeptic says, how can I know that Jesus lived? Well, aside from the information of Herod's reaction, aside from the wise men coming to worship, aside from all that, this narrative, as I said, very intricate. And don't think this is disconnected because this forms the chronology. And if you're really wanting to know why this is so darn important, because we can trace back the course of that Zacharias, who is the father, will become the father of John the Baptist. We can trace back this course that he was serving to understand what that would actually mean. So most of you know this who've been around, who've heard me teach on this. But we know that Zacharias was officiating his priestly duties in the temple when this magic bomb is dropped on him, right? He hears, finds out, the angel tells him. He's basically doing the priest's office before God in the order of his course. And all of a sudden, an angel speaks to him, says, "Fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard. Thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son. Thou shalt call his name John. Thou shalt have joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice at his birth." Now, that whole way we're talking about first chapter, second chapter, and then the second chapter is the birth of Christ, but it's very verbose in laying down all this information. So we know there were 24 courses of priests that administered service in the temple. If you want a full list of those priests, you've got to go, I'm not turning there, but you've got to go to 1 Chronicles 24. Each course had a title associated with it. So Samuel and David were responsible for establishing these 24 courses. The course that Zechariah served was the 8th course. So people say, what's the course? Imagine I'm 1, you're 2, 3, 4. Zacharias was number 8, all right? And these corresponded to times of the year. There were set times for their service. So think about this. They would serve their course, which would last 1 week, and they would do this twice in a year because you've got 24 courses, 2 times is 48, and the 3 courses or 3 weeks where we don't read of it, it's because all the priests served all simultaneously because these were the 3 big, busy, biggest holidays, right? So that kind of gives you an idea of the how, the why, the when, the where. Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, was also a person who served as the priest in the first course, number 1, if you will, called Jehoiarib. And so you might say, well, okay, you just said that these courses were established by David and Samuel. Yes, they were. And then, of course, we know that the kingdom is ripped apart and the people are to the north deported and then to the south. But when they come back, they realized, Houston, we have a problem. We only have 4 priests out of the original 24 courses. We only have 4. So they set out to re-establish those courses, which were done under Ezra to re-establish the proper service in the temple. Now, all this is a lot of information. You're saying, whoa, what do I do with all this? Well, why would you put all this information about his service and the time that he's serving and how long he served, including also the narrative of the birth of John the Baptist, the conception of Jesus in the womb of Mary? Why would you weave this very intricate story that ties back into the Old Testament? If you're just making it up, you could just say, hey, Mary had a little lamb, called his name Jesus. I like my version better. It's much more simple, right? So here's what we do know. As I said, 52 weeks in each solar year, but the Jewish calendar was calculated by lunar solar, so we would only have about 51 weeks, and that's how you remedy if you take the 48 weeks and there's 3 weeks difference, and they would add in time as needed to make sure that the times stayed proper and aligned according to how they did it. Don't ask me, because that is really confusing. But if a priest served a cycle totaling his 2 go-rounds, so let's just say you're number 1, like Josephus was, you're first to serve, 25 weeks later, you're first to serve again, right? So you've served twice in a year for 1 week at a clip each time, and then in those 3 weeks that are not accounted for, everybody serves. That should be clear, right? Okay. Now, why am I telling you that Zacharias served in the 8th course when the announcement of their child, John the Baptist, was made? Because this gives you chronology. This gives you the ability to know. You can go back into the courses and realize that each priestly course started in Nisan, the first month of the Jewish ecclesiastical year. The courses started with Sabbath, so Sabbath to Sabbath, if you will. And you'll find in Luke phrases like the second first Sabbath. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I just explained it. It's referencing back to the courses of the priests. So it becomes important because the same passage says 6 months later, Jesus was born. Now, you are just a fantastic pathological liar to weave such an intricate story and get me sucked into the courses of the priest and all this other stuff. Or you're looking at the bedrock of all of the information to validate the fact that he did indeed live. So you might say, okay, for most of us here, I'm sure maybe 99% of us, there's nobody here that's going, well, I didn't know this and I have a problem with this. It is, I'm building a foundation to be able to show that there are proofs, if you're willing to look, that on the surface, if we went into a court of law, a lot of my arguments would not hold up. They would not hold up. But if you put enough of those pieces of evidence out there, now you've got a whole bunch of evidence that you could say, well, this is a little weak over here. This doesn't line up with that. But you're looking at all of these pieces. Somehow you've got to ask, did the world go insane? Did Luke, who was not part of the original group, he comes a little bit later time, more associated with Paul. Do you think when Luke said he wanted to set all things in order, that he would set all things in order by basically giving us this wild fable about some kid being born and some spirit jumping in the womb to produce a child? Or did he sit down and write it all out? Now, the people who argue against this will say, who chronicled this? Luke wasn't there. Who chronicled this? Must you ask? Of course you have to. God did. And this is why I keep talking to you about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the helper to help us. Much like when people say, how could Moses have written 5 books of the Bible? He didn't. He had help. You start thinking about this, and it makes perfect sense that God, to be able to explain himself, must flow through the human being, but it doesn't mean it's from the machinations of a human mind. So I'd say, if you're really going to weigh this out, it's pretty verbose to just be a fantastic fable. Now, there are places in the New Testament that are connected or associated with the birth of Christ. If you remember, I started out by talking about these men following a sign, following a star. Our modern study of the sky was the tools for them. And I won't do it right now because it's a whole different subject. But let me just kind of give you an indicator of what we might be looking at next week. When you get into the book of Revelation, we read about a woman who gives birth to a child. And that whole passage is talking about the moon and the stars, and immediately we think, oh, this sounds a lot like the passage out of Genesis with Joseph. But this has another purpose for us to understand, and I don't think it's an accident that when you start looking at this woman, she's first in heaven or in the sky, and then she's down on earth. I think you start to put this into the sky again, and you realize that this is how they got certain terminologies for what's in the sky, beginning with the Virgin, Virgo in the sky, right? And Leo the lion, were the associations. This is not like somebody dabbling in the stars. The gospel is written in the stars, and I believe that the wise men actually saw it, and they interpreted it, and they could understand it. We would take decades to come to that knowledge, to see that the gospel was actually written in the stars. That passage out of Revelation leads us to an understanding about that. And if you put the whole together, you realize, again, if God hung the stars in the sky and he arranged all of it, it's either a happy accident or it's quite deliberate. Those are the things that you have to consider. I'm not going to go any further because opening this gateway into the stars and everything else opens up a bigger subject. But my focus for today was to lay the foundation, because there are still people who will every year do the same thing. I'd like to believe, but I just think, I don't know, I'm not sure. Well, here's enough for you to at least ponder. Let me paint it in real time now. Imagine me standing here and telling you a fantastic story. In 1975, a church that was on the rocks had been basically robbed and bled dry from charlatans that were here previously. I could start telling you the story, and if you didn't know it, you'd be like, could that be true? Is that possible? Could that have even happened? The fact that, I'm not proud to say this, but the fact that this actually, before 1975, I would say this ministry housed more charlatans in and out of the pulpit. But that'd be really hard to believe, considering we're kind of this hardcore group here. No nonsense, no games, no gimmicks. But it'd be really, really difficult to wrap your mind around the fact if I started telling you the stories, you'd say, well, that's too fantastic. That's how people approach this. They say it's too fantastic. But why weave all of these stories for someone who never existed? And then if you keep going, as I said, you have all of these dialogues that occur with Jesus in his public ministry. Dialogues with people who will be followers, and dialogues that occur with people who will just go their own way. Why? So I don't know. A person that doesn't exist doesn't have conversations with other people. A person that doesn't exist doesn't get put on trial, and a person that doesn't exist doesn't end up crucified on a cross. So we've got a lot to peel back, and you might say, well, this is just basic Christianity. It is, but it's long overdue Because now I can say when we have skeptics or people that are not sure, hey, listen, skeptics will be skeptics. And there's nothing that I can say to take away the doubt or the skepticism, but I can point you in the direction. You spend the time examining the evidence that really does demand a verdict. You spend time looking at all of these narratives, and you tell me that they could just be a mere fabrication from creative and cruel minds, or they are telling us the story of the beginning of the Son of God in the flesh come to save humankind. That's for you to decide. I'm going to keep laying out the evidence, enough so that maybe for those people who just say, well, you're either going to be interested in looking or it will just close the book for you. And actually, that's a good thing, because the people who are desirous to dig, they will dig, and I think their eyes will be open. Those people who are not interested, you didn't even show enough interest to begin with, so why bother, right? But for the rest of us, it's pretty glorious when you start looking at, people say, well, what would happen? What would you say if somebody told you Jesus didn't live? What would that do to your faith? Here's my problem. There's way too much from this book, old and new, and then you jump outside the book. After you've exhausted the book, you jump outside the book, and you start recognizing that there's just no way that a singular man that existed over 2,000 years ago could change and impact the world, ideas, shape and form kings, cities, humankind, and say it's just a ruse, it's just some magical fable we all just believe in just to get along. At some point, you do come to the place of saying, it's kind of irrefutable. Jesus lived. Now, the rest of this, becomes looking at his deity. Did he exist before time in the flesh? Did he perform miracles? There's a lot of those questions that we'll probe into, not for the sake of apologetics, but for the sake of setting up to show if somebody is looking, look where you can look to find the evidence, and then please don't tell me there isn't any. It's there, but you do have to look. Hopefully you'll be here, and I will show you. For right now, that's my message. It's really interesting that each and every Sunday I try to come and bring you whatever the Lord has put on my heart. It's very interesting sometimes, even for me. I'm shocked. Like, how did I end up speaking on this? But here we are. So hopefully it helps some of you. It should be that message that even you've settled your faith. This is what builds up and makes it even stronger, because you don't need to be convinced. You don't need to look at the evidence. But as we go, these are just things to put kind of in your back pocket. So everybody's had those conversations. Everybody has had those conversations. But, well, how do you know? Are you ready? You better sit down. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.